If you just had one word to describe the last 40 years, 1984 to 2024, could it be network? At one point, networks were probably most associated with fishermen, but then we had networks of roads and networks of electricity, radio networks, television networks. At some point in the early 80s, people started using network as a verb. It was really all downhill from there. Once people started talking about networking as a strange pseudo-social business interaction, well, we were toast. Speaking of pseudo-social interactions, we got social networks, and then something else that we might not even have a name for yet other than TikTok, scrolling stuff. Perhaps it's some sort of anti-social network. The movie Network is from 1976, and did it see all of this stuff coming? Not the fishing part, but some other things, maybe. When looking back at older, forward-looking movies, and this really is a movie looking into the future, which is now a movie anxiously looking around the corner, worrying about things that have maybe already seemed to be set in motion. When looking at these movies, it's easy to get carried away with confirmation bias, to see one or two things that happened, or that speak to you right now, and to think, wow, they had psychic powers, when in fact, maybe they predicted a lot of things that didn't come true, or they missed a bunch of things that did. I'm not a big fan of the phrase, this movie is more important than ever, or it means more than ever. But I have to say, there's a lot of vitriol, cynicism, and frustration floating around the world right now. Traditional media is toast. People are more transistorized and diodized than ever, and network feels like it was made to be watched right now. Before we get too carried away, though, Network is in some ways is actually a classic movie. Really, it's a lot of different things at once, but there are parts that feel like the 1940s or the 1950s, some stories of virality that have a very Hollywood feel to them. Meet John Doe is a great comparison. That's a Frank Capra movie from 1941 about a frustrated newspaperman who writes a fake letter to the editor from a frustrated John Doe who says he's going to pull a Howard Beale on Christmas Eve. No less. I can't be more specific than that due to the production code of YouTube, but if you want to know what happens, you can watch the whole movie for free on Wikipedia because it's been in the public domain since 1969. I won't spoil anything, but John Doe clubs end up springing up across America. It's a big groundswell, a social movement the way only Capra could tell it. If you think that virality is something that started with the internet, well, totally wrong. And there's a lot of great cinematic counter examples of that, like A Face in the Crowd, Ace in the Hole, movies about big sensations. There's also, tons of movies about newspapers, traditional media, and there's lots of movies about sort of self-referential stories of media like film and television or even plays. So there's plenty of stuff that Network does that was not new at all. And I think you can feel the classical strain to it at certain points. At the same time, the movie is almost overwhelmingly fresh. As soon as you start the film, you're hit by the narration. Lee Richardson provides the voice of the narrator. He had a small role in the amazing Sidney Lumet film Prince of the City. I have a video about that. Maybe he and Sidney were friends. Who knows? This narration is kind of odd for a feature film. It doesn't come from a character in the movie. In fact, it sort of comes from outside of the movie. It starts by saying that this is the story of XYZ. Sort of outside the movie. It's not totally unprecedented, but the film combines a lot of things here to feel very different. This opening scene has 4 televisions, side by side, by side by side. It's kind of your typical spinning up the broadcast scene. Like the China Syndrome had some similar moments, but wait, that came out afterwards. So I don't know if it's fair to call this typical. This may have been a pioneering film in the way that it showed sort of the backstage of TV. One thing that I think is interesting about the beginning of the movie is how it treats focus. This is most explicit when nobody is really paying attention to the broadcast that's going out and Howard Beale says something bizarre. Perhaps it's asserting rather clearly that television is an inattentive medium. There's something slightly more subtle going on here too, though. There's a number of times where the movie itself is kind of out of focus, not visually, not literally. The main technique they use is actually overlapping audio, hearing snippets of a few different conversations at once, not really knowing what are we supposed to be looking at here? What are we supposed to be hearing? What's the focus? The camera will kind of be hunting around, showing you different things. This has become pretty standard grammar for showing things getting set up at the beginning of some kind of broadcast. I'm not going to tell you that Network invented it. I don't think it was so common in 1976. So it's interesting. Focus, stylistically and literally, being in the middle of the story about television. Network uses a ton of different techniques, though. It does a ton of different things. I'm not going to be able to cover them all. Undoubtedly, a dynamic movie, which has out-of-focus moments. A lot of scenes that begin in the middle of things. Not too much exposition. A lot of a lot of jargon in the movie, terms people might not really No, not spoon-feeding you, almost sort of a documentary feel in it, in the middle of the action kind of feel. It feels frenetic and almost impersonal at times, but there are also some intimate moments, some more classic moments, some pieces that would seem more at home in a social dramas, some opportunities for big acting. This movie, did great at the Academy Awards, lots of nominations and wins for acting. I actually don't think the acting in the movie is that outstanding. Well, give me a moment here. William Holden's speeches, they're a bit overcooked in my opinion. It's cool that he was still doing movies in his later years, although he was only in his late 50s when Network came out. He died relatively young in 1981. Of course, this movie is part of the Faye Dunaway series, by the way. Recently picked up this book about Faye Dunaway by Faye Dunaway, sort of, so that will probably be featured in future videos once I read it. We'll talk about her a little bit. I actually don't think she's that great in this movie. It almost seems like she's doing a shoddy Meryl Streep impression. Of course, Meryl Streep had not been invented yet. In fact, her first film role would come the following year in the Fred Zinnemann film Julia. Dunaway does pretty well with the evil and heartless but desirous role. I think they make it a little bit too on the nose in the end, and I don't know. Performance didn't quite ring true for me, but it's fine, I guess. When I say the acting isn't great, of course, I'm not talking about Peter Finch, who is incredible in the movie. You probably already know that he was the first person to win a posthumous Best Actor award. If you didn't know that piece of trivia, you're watching the wrong channel. Please leave now. Did you know, though, that he was the first Australian to ever win Best Actor? Interestingly, Heath Ledger, also Australian, also the other guy to win the posthumous Academy Award. Anyway, this was not Peter Finch's last movie. His final role was playing Israeli Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin. Can you name the movie? Peter Finch had an incredible career, including starring in my favorite movie of all time, more or less. He was widely known as a drinker and a womanizer, and some of the torment and the desperation in his performance in Network may have been real. I also like Robert Duvall in the movie. There's some intertextual work going on here as he plays kind of a consigliere type at this television station. His character feels really modern to me, like the kind of Wall Street guy you could find if you stepped outside the door right now and walked down the street. Howard Beale is an iconic character, and one that works in fairly subtle ways. I watched Network for the first time more than 10 years ago, I think, and you know what they say, when I was a child, I watcheth movies like a child. I think that's the verse. I think I was, at the time, thinking Howard Beale should be someone that you're rooting for, unconditionally, more or less, the protagonist. Seeing the movie now, it's clear that he's a pretty erratic character. He says a couple of things that resonate, a lot of things that are vague or inconsistent, a couple of things that are insightful. When I first watched the movie, I was hanging on his every word. Now I see that the film itself doesn't really privilege or prioritize some of the things he says. They cut away from him mid-broadcast. The movie has a lot of this shifting ground, and Beale being erratic and a bit hard to put into a classic Hollywood role is a big reason for it, but not the only reason for this sort of shifting moral ground. A lot of the characters move around, actually. Max is a principled defender of the newsroom, but he's also not above a tryst. He's not loyal. Diana is evil, but also she's kind of nice. Even Hackett has an honest turn. It's interesting when honesty supplants true principles. Ultimately, this movie has a lot of moving pieces. When you watch it, you're in among it. You're feeling the churn. It's not a simple story, not a formulaic thing you're following along. It's something bristly enough that it feels like it could actually be the truth. Almost too big to hold it all in your head at the same time. Let's get back to this question of predicting the future. Was Paddy Chayefsky a psychic or just a cynic? I have a video about his earlier movie, The Hospital. He won an Academy Award for that, as well as this, and as for Marty, also back in 1955. The Hospital is probably more on the cynical side of things. I wasn't a huge fan about that movie. My feeling about Network is that it is ahead of its time, but maybe not by as much as you would think. This is all kind of arbitrary semantics, I guess, to some degree, but if you were to fast forward 10 years to 1986, by then a lot of people were grappling with institutional collapse and the spread of markets to parts of life previously driven by ideals. Late capitalism, you might call it. The cat was out of the bag about this by the 1980s. So ahead of its time, but maybe just by, 5 or 10 years. Let's zoom in on one specific idea here. This film ponders a lot of different things, but Diana's approach to programming the news is really significant. One of the biggest ideas in the movie, maybe. You might be surprised that a news channel would have someone in charge of programming at all. Isn't the news just the things that happen? Isn't the world what programs it? Sort of, but something's got to get it up onto the screen. Somebody's got to decide what to show. And I think Diana makes a point in the film that news has always had an exploitative potential. It's always had an exploitative nature. It's lingered on tragedies. It sensationalizes things. Well, her approach is even more aggressive and blurs the lines between documenting the news and creating it. This is an idea that has been explored in a lot of movies, the line between just documenting the news and creating it. Natural Born Killers, Man Bites Dog, those are movies about that. They're both from the 1990s. But you can go back to the 1960s and watch Medium Cool to find some similar stuff. That's a really underrated movie about the media, by the way, directed by Haskell Wexler. We were just talking about him in the video about the Thomas Crown affair. That movie stars Peter Bonerz, the dentist from the Bob Newhart Show. He was also a big part of the production of the TV show Friends. Anyway, this idea of editorial responsibility, or lack thereof, also flows through the history of reality television, which Network kind of anticipates. In 1976, the term reality television didn't exist. There was reality and television, but they'd yet to be combined. If it did exist, it probably would have referred to Candid Camera. There was also An American Family. That's a show bouncing around at that point. I think that started in 1973 or something like that. We had a long way to go before you got to the reality television as we know it today. But this movie, the way that it sort of blurs the editorial lines, is kind of foreseeing that a little bit. So again, it's not a totally unprecedented idea. And it's something that maybe in a decade, a lot more people would have been thinking about, perhaps because of this movie in part. Nonetheless, clearly, there's something prescient going on here. Sometimes you hear people talk about how this movie was supposed to be satire, but now everything has come true, so it has a different meaning. In fact, I said something a lot like that about Network, even in my video on Bob Roberts. Watching Network now, I actually don't totally agree with myself from 2 weeks ago or whatever, a month ago. I wasn't around in 1976, so I don't know exactly how it was received. It has changed somewhat without a doubt, but I'm not sure it was ever some whimsical farce about things that could never happen. Maybe, these things were like more of a movie about things that people were anxious about being in motion, giving names to certain anxieties about changes in the world. Of course, even if it was plausible that these things could happen, there's still a big jump between it being plausible that it could happen and it having actually happened, or having happened decades ago and being commonplace. So definitely it has changed in some ways, but there are also parts of the movie that aren't really concerned with the future. Mainly it's forward-looking, but not all of it. There's a scene, for instance, with the negotiations between the Ecumenical Liberation Army, or I think they're called that, and the TV network, UBS. This is a satire of 1960s radicals and corporate type, and it's not really alleging any particular grim future. It's more of a send-up of the current era, or the one that was just coming to a close. I think it's pretty funny, too. There are also just some jokes in the movie that aren't really satirical at all. So yeah, the movie probably reads differently today, but I don't think it's quite so simple as, well, everything already happened, and now kids these days, they don't even know that this movie is supposed to be satire. I don't think so. I think it's still pretty clear that it was satirical, and in some ways, I think it hasn't changed that much the way that it would have been received, although I'm sure it is a little bit different, and it is, without a doubt, a prescient and profound thing. For me, though, the most profound thing about Network isn't whether it's still funny or about whether it predicted any specific trends. It's just how it captures the feeling of the world. It's how remarkable, how it captures the way that a lot of people seem to be feeling now. Rampant disenchantment. I'm not going to take it anymore. Well, what is it? People can barely articulate what they're frustrated about, or maybe they can, but everybody's got different problems. You can't wrap your head around these things. The world is just spinning out of control, it would seem. In Network, the causes and the effects are really tangled up. The causes and the effects are tangled up. Howard is frustrated by the world, but him being on air is probably making things worse. He starts to realize this as he uses his platform to rail against his platform, to say that people are slaves to their TVs. Wait, but aren't you on TV? To say that his network itself is corrupt. Wait, but isn't that you? When all these people take to their balconies to shout, are they putting the world back together or tearing it apart? Vitriol and frustration are defined by a cruel irony, which is that they make things worse. Is this frustration the inevitable product of institutional decline? Is it also one of the causes of institutional decline? Max is downcast when his daughter shouts from their window. You might say, well, what's the big deal? Things change. Institutions come and go. Perhaps. But there is some sense of momentum, some sense that wherever we're headed, we're picking up speed. I could talk about this movie for a long time, but let's look at just one more thing. Just like Howard Beale foretells his own death in the movie, Network itself knows it's not long for the world. You can probably draw pretty deep parallels between the movie and the character, with all of its fragments, its unexpected turns. Howard grapples with the platform that he has, the medium that he's entwined with. The movie also grapples with this kind of thing. Sticking with this segment about the vigilante group, yes, this is based on the story of Patty Hearst. Go look at her Wikipedia page if you don't know who that is. Very interesting story, very famous daughter, played in Network by Walter Cronkite's daughter. So it's pointing to a real event, but also look at that hat. Why is Patty Hearst wearing a beret? Well, there is a famous picture of her wearing a beret in real life, although she didn't wear one during the holdup like we sort of see in the movie. But maybe it also reminds us of a certain Faye Dunaway movie, Bonnie and Clyde. She plays Bonnie, I think. Generally, that movie is thought of as pretty highly, but you do wonder about this question of sensationalizing and romanticizing crime, or more subtle social problems, sensationalizing them, romanticizing them. Do even some of the most serious movies suffer from that, just like some of the most serious broadcast news? Sure. And does Network suffer from that? To some degree, it probably does. But I think there's self-awareness here, which is one of the deepest virtues of this film, surely, self-awareness. That's a fleeting thing in life and in movies. Fleeting and unruly, easy to imitate with self-reference and cynicism, but rare to truly experience. This movie does it, but self-awareness is unstable, I think. Something that will blind you if you look at it for too long. Like I said, Network seems to know that it isn't long for the world. That just like the news was becoming more commercial, maybe film and all the other media would too. Maybe society was going to. At the hands, well, somehow in lockstep with this frustration and disenfranchisement that both propel it and were caused by it. The cruel optimism of frustration. Network scooped up a bunch of Academy Awards, but it lost Best Picture to Rocky. I'm not going to read too deeply into that, but pretty confident that you couldn't make a movie like this today. Not long for the world. Man, a lot of pieces here, but to me, like I said, the thing that stuck out to me more than anything was emotion in this film, and how the cynicism and the vitriol in this movie seem to be what are defining the world today. So, if you haven't seen Network recently, if you haven't seen it ever, go check it out again. Let me know what you think. Next week, we'll do another Faye Dunaway movie, and maybe I'll have some interesting tidbits from this book.